Hello everyone, I'm Nandhini Giri. I'm a faculty in the School of Applied and Creative Computing at Purdue University, and I'm also the Director of Experience Realities Lab at Purdue. I'm very excited to be a part of the Games User Research Summit 2025 online speaker series, and today I'm going to present a case study. This is a classroom experiment of introducing a systems approach to framing better games user research questions. To provide some context here, so I teach a course which is focusing on player-centric approaches to designing games, and I have students who are majoring in game development. These are both undergrad and graduate level students who take my course so that they could learn some of the game's user research methods and apply it in their own development projects. So as an instructor, my objective is to both motivate them to apply more games user research in their dev process, but also provide them with tools and conceptual frameworks that they can take away from this course. So why take a systems approach? Normally, students are provided with problems which are more linear in nature. They look into isolated components, talk about the cause and effect relationship, identify different problem roots, and then come up with solutions. Whereas games are quite complex, as we all know. It involves several interconnected layers. It is not just a single player's user journey, but it involves interaction with multiple players. There are the game mechanics, there are the subsystems, the rules, the different design elements, and then to cover it up, we also have different social and cultural context playing over the experience here. So a systems approach, I believe, provides students with a more holistic perspective of not just looking into a linear isolated problem here, but to be able to look at it from a more from a zoomed out bird's eye view perspective and be able to talk more about the interplay between the different components and the emergent characteristics. So this case study, it's spread across 2 semesters and it involved around 65 students. So here is an outline of my presentation today. I'll be talking about some of the theoretical foundations that inspire my work, a need for systems thinking in game dev, and the problems, the challenges that I face in classroom, which could also translate into the industry. The two approaches of the same project, starting with the first iteration, which is a traditional approach of applying games user research methods, and then a systems approach. And finally, I'll share my own lessons that I learned through this process that could be applied in gaming studios or even software teams that are focusing more on gamified and game-based approaches in their applications. So to start off, I'm really inspired by Professor Mike Seller's work of applying a systems approach into game design. So he talks about the core player feedback loop here, which kind of forms the fundamental interaction between the player and the game system. So to me, what is interesting here is for students to be, or even game designers, researchers to be applying user studies, it's really nice to understand the player's intent of interacting with this game system and also to be able to break down this game system into its different components to in order for this feedback loop to be most efficient and to make sure that the design elements have the maximum impact, the most intentional impact on the player. This figure really provides that core loop which could be studied further to be applied in user research methods. So here it talks about the player's intent, which leads into the player's action, and then once the game undergoes its own internal change, then the feedback is returned back to the player. That way it closes the loop. However, the player's action also has a progression happening in the game world, which could be rewarding and reinforcing the player's intent. So this is something that I wanted to take back into my classroom and conduct it more as a systems activity, so students are able to break down the game system first, be able to understand the player's intent and also the game's internal change, the internal subsystems at play, and then form their user studies. So the problems. Students are mainly focused on developing games. So they are mostly excited about a single idea, or maybe there's a game, a very popular game that they normally play, and then they end up creating another copy of that same game. So to me as an instructor, it's important to both challenge them to think about new player interaction methodologies or new modalities of interaction, looking into how different elements of design in the game system can affect the player the most. So moving from a more ad hoc mindset to a more systematic approach of designing user studies for their projects. And also when I ask them questions about do you do any playtesting, how do you collect data, how do you study your players' needs, normally it's just a team member doing the playtesting, and these are not intentional studies. It's just to make sure there are no bugs or any runtime errors going on. So the following projects that I'll be talking about are really to counteract these problems and to enhance the user research that is applied in these student works. So back to the context, this is a coursework here in my institution, and both at grad and undergraduate level. So normally it's a 16-week semester, and we focus on the first 8 to 9 weeks of the course, mainly doing two of these projects where they are asked to design user studies, recruit participants, conduct the study, collect data, analyze the data, and then provide the report. So overall, this is my experience from 2 semesters, and I've had around 65 students. So again, the objective of this case study is to start off with a traditional approach, and then the second iteration using a systems approach, and to see whether students perceive this to be a more efficient way of understanding game systems, and then applying user research methodology on top of that. And also I'd like to build some guidelines for pedagogical implications of training students in games user research methods. So I'm hoping that I'm focusing more on students, my population. However, these insights could also apply in onboarding graduated students, or even in multidisciplinary teams where you're looking into different products and applying a systems approach. So in the first iteration, during the first, second weeks of the class, students were given a project brief where they are to select a game and a target player group, frame 3 research questions, and then select an appropriate method to be able to collect data, to be able to evaluate and analyze and prepare a report. So here we did some class activity of identifying students' own player types, so they understand what kind of motivation clusters and categories they fall into, and why that psychologically impacts them in playing the games that they enjoy. And then have a discussion on each other's player type, what it means, and have such discussions. So Quantic Foundry is one place where students were able to take a survey and go through the different player types. And I also referred to some of the blog posts by Steve Bromley in terms of picking up an appropriate method, be it like a structured interview or a survey, and talk about the different instruments to see how well the research question or the research goal, the method, and the evaluation aligns with each other. So after the first report was submitted, so this was like the first iteration, and then students given the second iteration of the same project, where it was the same prompt of selecting a game, choosing a player type, target player group, and then framing the 3 questions and designing a study. But before they go ahead in the main steps of the project, they first had to do a classroom activity where students were grouped into 2 or 3 members in each team, and then they did a whiteboard activity of selecting a game to identify the different systems and then break it down further into subsystems, look into the different inputs that go into the system. This could be from the player to the system, or it could be like one, maybe it's the health system subsystem that is talking to another combat system, and then talking about the outputs. So once they started working on this activity of breaking it down into different systems and labeling the interactions, I also forced them to think more into what are the components of the game that are influencing the player's attitude or the behavior, and do you see it being done well, or whether the design really impacts the player's behavior. So this was a classroom experiment, a classroom activity, and then students, after doing this whiteboard activity, had to present their work, and then we had some discussions, and this was very interesting to do. So after this activity, they ended up doing the same research study design where they had these 3 questions. They had to recruit participants, and then there was an analysis, and then this time there was a work in progress presentation as well as a final slide deck that was submitted for the assignment. So here are like some quick sketches that comes from the classroom activity where students first started off with the broad systems in play, and then they ended up looking at the inputs, labeling them, and then kind of studying like which one is the most important, the most impactful, what makes sense to study more to see how the player's experience can be made better. So the learning outcome of both the iterations is for students to be able to describe the core concepts of games user research, to be able to explain how the design elements can improve the player experience, and also identify target user groups, and to design a user study, plan it, and to execute. So ideally, it's kind of them taking up the whole ownership of studying the player group, being able to then do a system analysis, and then designing the game and executing the study. So again, to recap, the iteration 1 focused more on the target audience. It was mainly based on the player types, and students even had to do a persona diagram of their players, focusing on what are the motivations, what are the frustrations, and the limitations of accessing the game. And then the second iteration was the systems approach, where students had to actually break down the system that they were studying and be able to design research questions, and being able to focus more on the direct mapping between the design's impact on the player experience. So I'll just go through quickly the evaluation criteria. So here is the rubric where the first one is on the study design. So asking questions about how well structured the design was in terms of the clarity of the research goals, whether the methods were identified well, and do they have a plan for player group recruitment for this study. And then comes the data analysis and collection. So is there a well-planned protocol along with a good documentation of the data, or students did follow a prototype, however it could improve they could improve the planning and the documentation, or the last score was like it requires another iteration and documentation is not sufficient. And this was the third rubric element on the insights. So how well students were able to take the user data and respond back to their research questions. Is it well aligned? Are they able to support their research report with evidence and proper user data, or was it totally not aligned? So some of the observations from the student work was that between the first and the second iteration, I saw there was a lot of clarity in identifying the game system components. So for example, if in the iteration 1, students had around like 5 questions in just the first, like I asked them to do 3 questions, And the first one itself had like multiple questions, where one focused on how well is the tutorial helping them do the boss fight, which wasn't just the one question. The next one right next to it is something about how players are using the UI of the system. So it was multiple questions clustered into the same, and there was no connection between the first sub question with the other. However, in iteration 2, once students started seeing the game more as a system and picking a certain subsystem, looking into a certain design element, and then mapping it back to the player experience, there was a lot more clarity and scoping and narrowing down of the scope of this question. So they then started talking about, here's the subsystem I'm focusing on for maximum impact, and then talking about more specific questions. Next, there was a better understanding of the impact of design elements on player experience. So while in the first iteration it was very superficial, some of them had very broad questions like, do players enjoy playing this game? Or is this design efficient? So moving from very abstract and broader level questions, students were now were able to be more specific about the exact elements that could lead to certain intentional changes and effects on the player behavior. And finally, when we had the work in progress sessions, students were able to have a more common language in providing a critique to each other. So the classroom activity where they did the systems breakdown was very interactive. And then to continue, when we did the work in progress peer review, it was very helpful for students to really pick up, like, oh, you're talking about this subsystem. Did you consider this input? Or, okay, you're focusing more on the cognitive load or the memory of players. Why didn't you consider the other? So there was an opportunity for a lot more discussions, and I could clearly see how students were having a better mastery over the game's user study methodologies. So it's very important to talk about the limitations of the study. So I started this more from a pedagogical standpoint. I didn't really conduct a study that could quantify, how whether the first iteration or the second one is better. There's always the kind of effect that students are doing the systems approach as a second iteration, so they've already been exposed to games user research methodology in interaction in iteration 1. So there's definitely going to be a better understanding in the second iteration, which is obvious. However, looking into the evaluation criteria, especially the study design and also the way students were building the insights, there was quite a lot of improvement in terms of how students were framing these questions. So the lessons learned for me here is that a systems approach can definitely be a great pedagogical tool for training game dev teams. I really saw students appreciate the process, and they started suggesting that maybe we do a parallel course where we have like a game dev practicum along with the games user research course. So that way there's a lot of live data that students could take from their own projects and apply it in this class. And definitely the class became a lot more interactive, and we had richer conversations once we started incorporating the systems framework. It helps look at the game more as a product, and it encourages students. So rather than just looking at games just as fun and for that sensory, addiction, students started looking more into the players' needs and how it's important to really look into the market, and how their game could be a good fit in the product, and what kind of a demography or the motivation cluster that their games could target on. So there was a lot of mindset shift among game developers, and it did provide a common language to critique peer work and to reiterate work. So that definitely also helped me in terms of how I was able to provide feedback to students. So rather than just talking about the grammatical aspects of phrasing these research questions, we were now able to talk at a more higher level, looking at, okay, you want to focus on this system. Does it really, what is the impact of it? Is it just impacting a small group of players? Is that what you want to focus on, or you want to apply this to a larger population? So we were able to have more of those rich and productive conversations. And finally, students were also asked to do some self-reflections, the group feedback, and we did a few postmortems of some of the user studies, and that definitely accelerated the learning process in my classroom. So again, reiterating the fact that future work in this direction will involve a more quantitative study where there are specific metrics that I would like to measure. Probably I could even do like a controlled group which doesn't follow the systems approach, and maybe one or two groups could do the iteration 1 and iteration 2 to see where the accelerated learning happens, but that's in store for the future. So that was future work, and thank you so much. That brings it to the end of this presentation. I'm really happy to be here, and I look forward to your questions, and please share your own insights, whether it's in classroom teaching or if it's training within the industry, what kind of methods you're following, and if there are other ways of introducing the systems framework for games user research. Thank you so much.